moderator today. Today, we have the pleasure of NUS President, Professor Tan Eng Chye, joining us. I would like to invite Prof. Tan to give us a few words to kickstart the event.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Good morning. I'm happy to join you at today's webinar, jointly organized by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions and the Energy Studies Institute on the UN Conference of Parties, or COP26 as it's commonly known. So COP26 is an important meeting where nation leaders come together to address global climate change issues. Likewise, climate change is also an important topic for NUS, which is why we formed the University Sustainability and Climate Action Council to look at how we can coordinate and scale up the ongoing good work of NUS faculty, researchers, educators, operations, and administrators for greater impact. We hope to collectively support the national agenda, as well as catalyze solutions for global challenges. So I chair the council, and the members are drawn from a wide spectrum of the NUS community. Tackling climate change is not just about countries doing their part. Cities, universities, private sector, think tanks, NGOs, and individuals all have a role to play too. So I'm grateful to Lian Ping and Po Seng, both directors of CNCS and ESI, for inviting me to this webinar to learn more about what NUS and our partners are doing. Both of them are also members of this University Sustainability and Climate Action Council. Now, because it is instructive that the Council considers a broader context and voices as it looks into the longer-term cross-cutting sustainability strategy and plans. The university has been involved in the international climate change negotiations for some time now. NUS was admitted as a research and independent non-governmental organization to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2014. ESI is the designated contact point for NUS and has brought several NUS students and staff to COP meetings to broaden their exposure in recent years. As part of the Paris Agreement to keep global temperature increases under 2 degrees C, decarbonization and energy efficiency technologies are key to lowering carbon emissions and getting to net zero. Research into renewable energy, such as solar, has been carried out by our Solar Energy Research Institute for many years. New low-carbon energy sources, such as hydrogen, are getting a serious look with the establishment of our new Center for Hydrogen Innovations at NUS. Then, complementing all these approaches to reduce emissions are the nature-based climate research at CNCS, headed by Lian Ping, which focuses on green and blue carbon. Also, recognizing that there will be a growing demand for data centers associated with the rise of digitization, we are also setting up a testbed facility on NUS to develop innovative and efficient cooling solutions for data centers, especially in tropical locations. These are all part of this Sustainable Tropical Data Center testbed headed by Po Seng. Together with the energy policy research carried out at ESI, NUS is looking at an end-to-end spectrum of knowledge base that can support the energy transitions to a more sustainable future. We are using the university grounds as a testbed for innovative technologies as NUS works towards a carbon neutral campus by 2030. And we hope to work closely with our researchers, students, and adopt measures such as reducing energy consumption and improving energy efficiency, purchasing renewable energy, as well as installing more solar panels on rooftops, planting more trees on campus, to sequestrate carbon, as well as purchasing carbon offsets. All this to make our campus a greener one. Thus, universities are in a privileged position to respond to climate change challenges by harnessing the knowledge and creativity of our faculty and researchers and students, and by using our grounds intentionally. We do not take this privilege and responsibility lightly, so I'm glad to be part of this webinar today, which aims not only to raise awareness of COP26 and the climate change challenges, but also to open up opportunities for individuals, the civic society, the private sector, and many other players to turn this awareness into action by amplifying it within our own spheres of influence and through collaboration. So you are in good company today. For one, I know that all panelists and the moderator have been to COP meetings. Melissa has been representing Singapore and NUS for COP meetings since 2011. And Sandeep is also a stalwart at these meetings, offering the NGO perspective. Both are alumni of our Masters in Environmental Management program. Sharon is also a staff alumnus, having worked at our Center for International Law. And Audrey is an NUS alumnus who has been interviewing many of our faculty members and staff for her Straits Times Green Pulse podcast on the environment. So it is really a community of like-minded individuals working towards a common audacious goal. And I'm sure you will all have a very lively discussion. So once again, thank you for having me. I hope to join more of such environmental events and see you online in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Prof. Tan, for your opening remarks. And like you, I'm very keen to hear from our speakers today. But before we begin, there are some quick administrative issues to run through first. As the event is set up in a webinar format, participants are not able to raise hands or unmute to ask questions. So if you do have any, please post them in the Q&A box and who you would like to direct your question to. Please keep your questions brief and post them via the Q&A box and not the chat box. You may also upvote questions you want answered by our speakers, and we'll get to them sooner. If you face any technical difficulties during the webinar, you may contact the host via the chat function. The webinar is being recorded, and the session recording will be uploaded onto the CNCS YouTube channel with subtitles. So let's begin. Today, we have a distinguished lineup of experts here to share about COP26. They will give us an overview of COP26, including the goals of the event, the issues being negotiated, its relevance to Singapore and ASEAN, and how the conference can be a catalyst for climate action. Before we hear from the speakers, let's just hear from them with a brief introduction of themselves, starting with Melissa. Melissa, please.
Thank you, Audrey. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa. I'm a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at NUS, and I do research on energy and climate change. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. That's short and sweet. Up next, we have Sandeep. Sandeep, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Sandeep Sanmingrai. I'm Senior Advisor on Global Climate Adaptation Policy Work, part of the WWF Climate and Energy Practice hosted by WWF Singapore. And as Prof. Tan said, I'm one of the MEM alumni together with Melissa. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Sandeep. Really loving your climate strikes background, by the way. And finally, we have Sharon. Sharon, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Center for Nature-Based Solutions and ESI for inviting me. My name is Sharon. I'm the coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center, as well as the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Like Prof. Tan said, I am a staff alumnus as well as a student alumnus. I graduated from NUS many years ago. So thank you again, and I hope that I can learn more from everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Right now, we'll hear from our speakers. Each of them will share their remarks for about 10 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A segment. We will end promptly at 11:15 a.m. Singapore time. So first, we have Melissa to share with us an overview of COP26 negotiations.
Thank you very much, Audrey. And thank you all for joining us this morning. I have a lot of material to cover in just 10 minutes, so I will zoom through very quickly. But as Audrey said, the session is being recorded and will be posted on CNCS YouTube page. So please, if there's anything that I've been through very quickly, you can go on later on and check it out. Okay, so today I'll be sharing an overview of the Paris Agreement and COP26. But first, I would like to maybe delve a bit deeper as to NUS's role at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COPs. As Prof Tan earlier mentioned, NUS has been accredited to the UNFCCC since 2014. ESI is the current focal point, and what we do is to do research and capacity building efforts from NUS, and you can see some of the pictures here. We have organized side events at COPs before and exhibitions as well. We also are invited sometimes to speak at pavilions and side events at the COP. We also help to coordinate and organize at times meetings when the ministries reach out to us from the Singapore delegation. And so over the years, we've been very privileged and honored to meet with Minister Masagos at the COPs and also with working level staff. And it helps our delegation members, including staff and students, as well as other NGO members, to understand better what the Singapore delegation is there to do at the COPs. When we come back from COPs, we also do outreach to schools, to the youth and to the public. We've worked very closely with NUS entities, including the NUS Office of Environmental Sustainability, RVRC, and others, as well as the National Youth Council, to organize and mount workshops to train youth and educators on climate change negotiations. Okay, let me start on the presentation proper. So the international climate change regime is as such. It starts with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992. And there are two treaties that you must know. The first is the Kyoto Protocol, which was in force from 2005 onwards, and its first commitment period was from 2008 to 2012. The Doha Amendment was supposed to extend the lifetime of the Kyoto Protocol, but it's currently not yet in force because we don't have 2/3 of countries ratified the Doha Amendment just yet. The Paris Agreement was adopted in December of 2015, and it had come into force much earlier than expected, in 11 months later. So right now, countries are finalizing the rule book to the Paris Agreement, which has no definite deadline. All right, so that's something that we're always quite confused about. It is supposed to be self-ratcheting up in terms of the ambition levels. So to understand the Conference of Parties, this is a very quick guide. The COP stands for Conference of Parties to the Convention, which is the umbrella UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They meet annually, usually in November or December, and the sessions are numbered. So the first Conference of Parties was held in Berlin in 1995, and that was COP1. The CMP stands for the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. I know it's a mouthful, but because the Kyoto Protocol came into force only in 2005, they had their first meeting then, so CMP1, and then it carries on from there. And when the Paris Agreement came into force, CMA1 was held. So if you look at the logo of the COP26, you'll see /CMP something /CMA something, and that usually indicates the number of meetings that have been held before. Each year, one country or one party is elected to serve. And of course, this year we know that the UK is serving as the president, but they are doing so with the Italians who have hosted the pre-COP as well as the Youth for Climate before this. There are two permanent subsidiary bodies to the COP, the convention that support the COP, CMP and CMA. These are the subsidiary body for implementation and subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, SAPSA and SPI. So many of the current agenda items on the Paris Agreement, the remaining issues are actually covered under the SAPSTA as well as SPI. And these bodies meet together with the COP, CMP and CMA, and they meet also an additional time in May or June in Bonn, Germany. Of course, this year, due to the pandemic, we were not able to host one session, but it was held online, right? So it was not a formal, it was formal, but the outcomes could not be placed in a formal legal outcome because some parties were opposed to it. These are the two SBI and Substar chairs. You want to pay attention to them if you are going to COP or you're following from here. If you want to learn more, you can actually look at this interview that has been posted online with and to understand a little bit more about what the Substar and SBI chairs do at the COP, trying to consolidate and coordinate countries' views. Coming to the Paris Agreement very quickly, the Paris Agreement, as I said, was adopted in December 2015, and it entered into force 11 months after its unprecedented early entry into force. And one must understand that the COP, the Paris Agreement's overall objective is to hold the increase of global temperature to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. All parties that are under the Framework Convention to Climate Change and who are party to the Paris Agreement have to adhere to the rules that are decided under the Paris Agreement. When you read the Paris Agreement, you must do so together with Decision Text 1 CP21. And this is really important because it sets out the roadmap, or it had set out the roadmap for how the Paris rulebook was to be completed. Okay, so it's like minutes to the meeting. Okay, which body does what and by when. Now, these are the key elements of the Paris Agreement that had to be finalized by 2018. And we are already in 2021. So one of the main things that has not been agreed yet is market and non-market approaches, which I will come to in a short while. The Katowice COP24 was the COP that was supposed to see the finalization of the Paris rulebook, and we now know the rulebook as the Katowice Climate Package, because this was the moment where the Secretary of State and COP presidency at the time, Mikhail Kurtyka actually leapt off the dais because he was so happy that there was an outcome at COP24. And this is really important because it sets out the implementation roadmap for the Paris Agreement. And without the missing piece of the puzzle, Article 6, it's actually very challenging for countries to actually meet their targets, because most NDCs now indicate that they want to use Article 6 mechanisms to meet their targets. Here are some of the key outstanding issues at COP, which I hope will help frame your sense of what COP is supposed to do this year. First, there needs to be greater climate ambition, and this can be seen through the collective NDCs. And the next slide, I will show you the latest synthesis report accounts for all of the updated and new NDCs that countries have submitted. So the second is common timeframes. All of the nationally determined contributors right now have 5 or 10-year timeframes. And so starting from 2031 or at the very latest 2036, countries should have a sense of whether the new NDCs are 5 or 10 years. And this is also one of the final pieces of the Paris Agreement that needs to be finalized. There ought also to be a new target for climate finance from 2025 onwards from the floor of $100 billion. Article 6 is one of the most talked about issues that COP26 will have to address, and I will come to that also in the next slides. Something that I'm interested in is transparency, and there are a few issues that have to be finalized at COP, which are the common reporting tables, common tabular formats, as well as outlines of biennial transparency reports and technical expert review report. And these issues ought to be finalized also so that countries can start to put together their biennial transparency reports from 2024 onwards. Something important to note is that Cambodia and Laos, our neighbors, are presenting their first biennial update reports at the Facilitative Sharing of Views workshop happening in the first week of COP. So if anyone's interested, you can tune in and hear what they have to say. I mentioned the synthesis report is really important. It accounts for a total of 165 latest available nationally determined contributions. Unfortunately, we still see that even if all countries said they'll do what they would do, and accounting for additional support that they hope to receive, we still are a little bit off the mark in terms of getting ourselves to 2 or keeping below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, and something to note here also is that China and India have not submitted their latest or updated NDCs. So we're hoping that in the next few days, they will do so. The second issue that I mentioned earlier that has to be finalized are common timeframes. As I mentioned, the ideal starting point for the new NDCs with common timeframes will be 1st of January 2031 or 1st of January 2036. And if the COP this year does not finalize this, it might delay and affect how countries prepare for their subsequent NDCs. The second issue is really highly talked about, Article 6, market and non-market approaches. So Article 6 has 3 operative paragraphs, which you probably will be familiar if you've been tracking this issue. So the first one, 6.2, talks about internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, and these can be used towards meeting countries' pledges. One of the key issues here is that how do we reduce the or avoid double counting completely through the basis of corresponding adjustments, basically having a ledger to ensure that if the host country sells the credits to someone else, it doesn't get counted again towards their own inventory. 6.4 basically talks about a new mechanism to generate carbon credits. It's very similar to the Clean Development Mechanism, but it will be under the Paris regime. And 6.8 will be a work program for framework for non-market approaches. And you recognize the person on the screen here as Minister Grace Fu, Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment. She has been invited by the UK COP President designate, the incoming COP President Alok Sharma, to co-facilitate the ministerial consultations on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement with her Norwegian counterpart. So this is very important and significant a role for Singapore to play. On the slide here, you see some of the outstanding issues that will have to be politically negotiated, and we very much hope and wish Minister Fu the best of luck in terms of getting countries to a landing zone or some consensus in order for Article 6 to be finalized. However, if there is failure to reach an agreement on Article 6, this does not prevent international cooperation on carbon markets. So something that we have to be clear about is that the voluntary carbon market is already coming through, and we have a lot of activity here, and parties can still undertake bilateral agreements outside of the ambit of the UNFCCC, but when it comes to accounting for them at the NDC, to the NDC, these may not be accepted at that point in time. Okay, so just to say that Article 6 pilots are already happening. So here you can see there was a report that shows that Article 6 pilots are already happening, and countries have actually used the last 2 years or delay of the COP to practice how it would be like to generate ITMOs and to work it into their reports. I mentioned Article 9, climate finance, earlier. One of the key issues of Article 6 also is something called share of proceeds. And I believe Sandeep will probably cover this a bit later. But basically, if Article 6 is finalized, every transaction that takes place under Article 6 mechanisms will put some money towards adaptation fund, because we know that countries need to start thinking about adaptation because we might fall short on our mitigation and to stop climate change entirely. There will also be deliberations on a new collective quantified goal. Wanted to highlight here that the new goal itself, the amount, need not be agreed in Glasgow COP26, but there is an expectation that the CMA will set out further detail on the new goal, and deliberations will be done to set the goal before 2025. Okay, very quickly, just 1 minute on logistics. COP will take place from this Sunday over 2 weeks at the Scottish Event Campus in Glasgow, UK. There is virtual participation element, but you have to be registered under a delegation. So you will be able to log in to the conference platform and tune in live, and that's what I will be doing because I'm not going to COP. But the idea being that most people will be able to access the COP platform and look at live webcasts and live streams. If you are interested in the COP, these are the agenda items, and please just go to the UNFCCC website and you'll be able to download the agenda. There has been a lot of momentum that's being maintained or generated since Madrid COP25, which was the last COP, but a lot of concerns remain about representation at the COP this year. So who you need to know if you're going to the COP, you need to look out for these people. These are the UK, the Team GB or Team UK, and they will be helping to ensure that the COP is successful this year. The detailed plan of the COP venue has not been released, but the event is listed in the blue and green. And if you want to attend the green zone events, I'm told that Google will be live streaming quite a few of the green zone events. So yeah, key schedule items you might want to look through. And if you are navigating the COP, like I said, just go online and you'll be able to. So with that, I just want to end here. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Mel, for your great overview of the negotiations this year. So just a reminder to our attendees, if we do have questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them later. Next up, we have Mr. Sandip Chamling Rai. Sandip, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So let me share my screen. I hope you guys can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So Mel has outlined in terms of what the COP26 is gonna present. I will be presenting more on the issue level about some of the opportunities and challenges that COP26 present and the key climate negotiation issue, especially on adaptation, loss and damage, and the nature-based solution, because this is the issue that I lead for the WwLoss delegation for the UNFCCC meetings. So without any further ado, I will very briefly touch on the adaptation agenda item at the COP26, followed by loss and damage, as well as the nature-based solution agenda and what we are expecting from this particular COP. So if you look for the adaptation, some of the key agenda item, I will not go into detail, but adaptation agenda item has been split into all 5 key items in terms of the COPs, the SBs, the CMA, and the CMP. And on the right hand side, you can see our expectation paper from COP26 that we had highlighted, and includes not only adaptation, but whole different range of items that can be negotiated at this particular COP. So if you have time, please do look out and read our expectation paper from this particular COP. But within the adaptation agenda item, I would highlight the key 3 key important elements that we really need to look or really need to closely monitor on. The firstly is on the global goal on adaptation, or GGA. So the global goal on adaptation was a part of the Paris Agreement Article 7.1, which really talks about enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability of the developing country. So that was agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015, but until now it has not been really operationalized in terms of how the GGA really comes into play and how it fits into the global stocktake process, which starts from year 2023. But there are a lot of consultation ongoing with the UK and the Chile presidency, even before the, I would say, pre-COP, and there might be a kind of a draft roadmap on the GGA based on our discussion with the UK presidency. But what we really expect from this particular COP in terms of operationalizing the global goal on adaptation, and how the progress will be really measured on the global goal on adaptation, and how it fits and how it helps to build the resilience of the vulnerable developing country in the overall, and also the means of support in terms of capacity and finance and technology for the developing country. The second key elements in the adaptation that we really want to look is National Adaptation Plan. The National Adaptation Plan, or the NAPS, helps each country to identify their mid and long-term adaptation needs of the country. And it was decided in 2011 under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. But until today, only 26 developing countries have submitted the NAPS, and I think South Africa was the latest one. So for this, at this particular COP, we are really looking a COP decision to encourage all developing countries to prepare and submit the National Adaptation Plan no longer than 2022, so that there will be a feed-in process for GST process, as well as us developed country to provide funding for that. And the last agenda item under the adaptation one is the adaptation finance. As we all know, compared to the mitigation, I would say finance, the adaptation finance is really lacking. I think on 25th of October, 2 days ago, UK has produced the climate finance delivery plan, which also really talks about 1/3 of the climate finance only go for the adaptation, and remaining 2/3 goes for the mitigation. So there is a big gap between in terms of the finance allocated for the adaptation. But having said that, the scale of adaptation finance need is really high. There is a study by the UNEP which talks about 140 to 500 billion per year financing needed to address adaptation needs in developing country. But it also linked with the share of proceeds, especially on the Article 6, particularly on Article 6.2 and 6.4. But there are also a few initiatives that was launched, I think, last month, especially during the UNGA, where the new champion group of adaptation finance was launched together with the country from the European and some of the Scandinavian countries. So at this particular COP, we really want to see much more bigger process on the adaptation finance, and how the adaptation finance is split between the mitigation and adaptation as well as the revenue that we collected from this year process. So these are the three key agenda items that we really want to look closely at this particular COP. And let me quickly talk on the loss and damage part. So before I go into detail, let me first define what the loss and damage mean, because this is a new topic. I would not say new topic, but it's really coming up really slowly compared to what's the adaptation and mitigation doing. So loss and damage generally means the impacts of climate change due to insufficient efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emission and inadequate adaptation action. As IPCC has clearly mentioned that adaptation and has its own limits. So at that time, the loss and damage comes in. But there is no agreed definition of loss and damage in the UNFCCC process. So that's also one of the issues why it is really hampering. So and just to explain what are the different types of loss and damage that we see. It can be quantified into two terms. One is the economic losses that can be quantified from a monetary point of view. For example, the climate extreme events giving I would say, or let's say, the climate extreme events impacting on the infrastructure or loss of your property or loss of your business operation. Those can be quantified on the economic loss. But there are some non-economic loss, especially the country like small and developing stage, where there'd be loss of territory, the loss of life, and loss of health, and even loss of biodiversity and loss of ecosystem services. So this comes under the non-economic losses of from climate change disaster. So, and loss and damage is part of the Paris Agreement, the Article 8. But what we had seen is that just a study from the IFRC, which mentioned over the last 10 years, more than 410,000 people were killed due to climate extreme events, which really displaced more than or affected around 1.7 billion people worldwide. And just in the year 2020 only, more than 30 million people were displaced due to weather-related events. And this is really happening even now when, if I talk about happening in South Asia or what happening in Pacific Island countries, there's a lot of displacement that we really see from climate disaster. And that falls under the issue of loss and damage. And if you look at the enhanced NDC, almost 1/3 of the enhanced NDC has mentioned loss and damage much more explicitly. And this was done by the researcher from University College London. And there are only 4 agenda items or 4 key topics that will be discussed on loss and damage in 4 different key themes. You can look much more detail where we as a WWF produce how to anchor loss and damage into the NDC. And this is our expectation, what we see from the Glasgow COP on loss and damage. But there are 2 elements that I really want to highlight that we really need to look very closely on the issue of loss and damage. Firstly, the Santiago network, in terms of how the Santiago network can be operationalized at this particular COP, which is structure defined, which is secretariat and function, as well as the funding. The second key element is loss and damage finance, because though the loss and damage has been already agreed in the Paris Agreement, but so far the funding is not there. So there are many NGOs, civil society, who are calling the success and the failure of this particular COP will be decided based on the outcome on loss and damage. So this is one of the key sticking issues at this particular COP. And let me talk last on the last topic on the nature-based solution at the COP26. So what we are really expecting. But before I go into the really NBS in climate negotiation, there were 2, I would say, decisions that took place in the last COP, in part of the COP25, which really talks about underlining the essential contribution of nature to address climate change and its impact to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner. And also welcome the Standing Committee on Finance and of organizing the financing for nature-based solution in 2020 forum. So nature, though it's really good to see the NBS is really taking a big momentum worldwide, but in the climate negotiation process, it was the only last year where the nature has been really enshrined or was embedded into the COP decision. But so far, we really don't have a nature-based solution decision in the UNFCCC. I would say no definition of the nature-based solution in the climate negotiation process. There are many organizations that put forward the definition of the NBS, but in the climate process, it's not there. So if this particular COP can really define what the NBS mean, that will be a very big win on this important issue. So we really need to anchor the nature-based solution at this COP outcome, especially the nature keeping 1.5 degree temperature rise within reach, and COP26 really present an opportunity to do so. The UK presidency is really elevating nature much more in the high level, but we don't have a nature as a negotiating, I would say, agenda item under the COP. So there are some challenges, especially the NBS is really getting momentum outside the UN process, but in the UN process, this very contentious topic of the NBS, and there is no agenda item of the NBS in the climate negotiation process. But having said that, within WWF, what we are really trying to see what can be done. So we talk about two things, that what the nature-based solution can be really anchored into the COP26 decision. The one, firstly, on the political declaration, like what we have seen in 1CP25, where it can be also part of the 1CP26, which really recognize the importance of nature and reaching 1.5 degree. And it also call for an alignment between the UNFCCC and the CBD, because even in the CBD, there is no definition of the NBS, because they only mention about the EBA, the ecosystem-based adaptation approach. And also, there is a food summit that may do some breakthrough on the NBS. So that's on the political declaration that we can really work on, like what we see in 1CP25 in Madrid. But there will be also second element where we talk about the operationalizing of the NBS within the COP decision, which will be really negotiated by the COP, by the individual parties. And we talk about the ambitious architecture, in which we call for the NDC to include NBS or nature into the NDC. And also within the GST process, one of the questions could be under the nature as well. On the finance, the forum on the SCF, and so I'm giving some guidance to GCF and GEF could be one. On the Article 6 voluntary market, there might be an opportunity where we can talk about, either talk about ITMOS, or I'll talk about the Sustainable Development Mechanism framework or non-market mechanism. Or we can really initiate a new processes on the NBS. For example, having a joint sub-Saharan SBI as an item on the NBS and flesh it out much more detailed in the coming future COP, or the outcome of the ocean dialogue on mitigation and adaptation. And lastly, also the global goal on adaptation will really define, and we can also really embed NBS into that particular element, the adaptation finance, as well as the share of procedure, where we can embed it nature much more strongly. So these are some of the, I would say, the political, I would say, declaration where we can really include NBS, and some of the, I would say, the negotiation level where we can really embed NBS into the COP decision. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take any question in later stage. Over.
Thank you, Sandeep, for your overview on adaptation, loss and damage, and nature-based solutions. I'm sure there'll be many questions for you later. Our last presenter is Ms. Sharon Xia. Sharon, please.
Thank you, Audrey. It's always nerve-wracking to be the last speaker because you have big shoes to fill. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, here we go. So I'm going to move everyone from the climate alphabet soup to now an ASEAN alphabet soup. You've been probably listening to so many acronyms, you're probably lost. So I'll try to keep it very simple so that we can, go through the issues very quickly. So I'm going to talk about what Singapore and ASEAN's expectations are for COP26 and where they stand. First, what are Southeast Asians' views on climate issues? My institute has done 2 surveys so far on the public perceptions and attitudes of Southeast Asians towards climate change. And this report is actually the second report. We surveyed 610 self-identified Southeast Asian respondents across the 10 ASEAN member states. It was conducted fully online, so came on to answer these questions. I'm just going to highlight for you several of the key findings that we've managed to come up with. The first is that the majority of Southeast Asians recognize the importance of climate change, with greatest urgency coming from Vietnam and Philippines. And you can imagine why, because they have been suffering the greatest impacts of climate change over the last few years, in particular with intensifying typhoons and cyclones. In a separate survey that we found, it was actually reported that Singaporeans have the least urgency because we live in a fairly safe place, and we haven't really experienced much of the severe impacts apart from flooding and so on, and greater rainfall. And this level of urgency actually decreases steadily across all age groups, from 76.5% amongst those under 21 to only 62% for those above 60. In terms of national climate policies and Paris goals, so all ASEAN countries have submitted an updated NDC. The last to submit was actually Myanmar. And in terms of respondents, Malaysia, Brunei, and Thailand do not think that their country's climate policies and laws are Paris aligned, whereas the greatest agreement came from Cambodia, Laos, and Singapore respondents. Of these, only 24.3% think that their country's policies across Southeast Asia, their country's policies are aligned with a 1.5 degree target. Around 70.9% say that their government is either not paying attention or are aware but not allocating sufficient resources to tackle climate change. Okay, another question we asked is about cutting reliance on coal. So majority agree that coal should be cut as soon as possible, with surprise, surprise, Indonesia and Singapore respondents demonstrating their strongest support for cutting coal. And the biggest disagreement came from Laos and Vietnam. So you might like to know that as of July 2021, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, and Bangladesh account for 4/5 of the world's coal pipeline. And according to data by E3G, another think tank, Indonesia and Vietnam are actually the two biggest users of coal in Southeast Asia. But some good news here, Malaysia and Philippines have announced moratorium on coal. Indonesia also recently announced plans to stop building new coal-fired power plants after 2023. And two other countries, Myanmar and Brunei, do not have any form of coal pipelines. So in summary, there's some movement, but it's insufficient to show any major transformational change and transition to a low carbon economy. In terms of ASEAN cooperation on climate change, it's overall a mixed picture. Only 31.8% agree that ASEAN is working effectively. And surprisingly, 60% of the respondents from media disagree. So they think that ASEAN is not cooperating at all. And only 48.1% from regional, intergovernmental, and IOs agree that there's some cooperation. So we asked a question about how ASEAN governments can collectively combat climate change, and we gave them these few options. You can see from this bar chart that the most popular options are actually for investments in renewable energy, for starting a regional forest conservation and restoration program, and encouraging businesses to set emission targets and disclose them voluntarily. Now, carbon pricing was the least popular, but it received support from 35.3% of Cambodians and 25% of Vietnamese respondents. We also asked a question on stimulus spending and green recovery. So last year we asked this question, which of the two crises, COVID and climate, which one should be prioritized? And majority of respondents says both must be prioritized, which means that they can tell that both COVID and climate are clear and present crises that cannot be ignored. This year, we follow on with a question about whether they see their government's stimulus spending moving towards a green recovery. So nearly half of them say that government stimulus spending did not contribute to a green recovery. And again, surprise, surprise, 55.9% from business, finance, and industry say no. When in fact, when you look at the stimulus spending announced by governments, much of the spending goes towards keeping businesses afloat. All right, so 50% at the country level, Laos and Vietnam say yes, but Malaysia and Thailand say no, majority. Okay, so just moving on, where do ASEAN countries stand? So the good thing is all of them have submitted their enhanced NDCs, so that gives them quite good standing to be at the negotiating table. I just wanted to show you this chart. It's quite hard to see the different lines, but here you can see actually from this source, ASEAN's total emissions is about 5.6% of the total global GHG emissions. The top emitter is Indonesia. You can see the top line here. They account for about 48% of ASEAN's total, and the rest of us take up 52% of the emissions. So the top three emitters are actually Indonesia, Thailand, followed by Malaysia, and the bottom few are Brunei, Laos, and Singapore. So going back to the NDCs, I hope by now you know NDCs stand for Nationally Determined Contributions. I've simplified all of their NDCs into two columns. One is the unconditional target that countries say they will achieve using their own resources, and the other column is the conditional target upon receiving international assistance. So you can see here that several countries, I mean, three of the countries have no conditional targets upon international assistance. The rest of them have, and really it's because developing countries find it very, very hard to be paying attention to both adaptation and mitigation. And in fact, in this region, adaptation is of a priority. Mitigation has not been so much of a priority because there simply isn't enough resources to go around. And when you look at all the NDCs, it is highly probable that ASEAN will not be able to meet its mitigations without assistance, and much less to make a difference to global emissions. Okay, what are Singapore's concerns and objectives? I think that there's high expectation for some deliverables in COP. And you have heard from Melissa that our Minister Grace Fu is actually co-chairing the Article 6 working group. And so there's a lot of expectation that there will be a finalization of the rule book for Article 6. But the question remains whether are there enough states that want that deal? And the second one is, can we get a deal that doesn't cut corners? So Melissa also talked about, double counting and all the very many ambiguities related to Article 6. The second one is Article 13. There are several political issues surrounding the enhanced transparency framework. I think Melissa will be much more in the know about what's happening in ETF. And the third one is common time frame. So actually it's not as common as one would think. They've been at this for years, deciding whether it's 5 or 10 years. And you would think that, a bunch of very clever people sitting in a room can decide this. But unfortunately, as you have gleaned from the presentation that Melissa gave, there's a lot of politics involved. Second point is Singapore's quite keen to see more inclusivity and support for developing countries towards a green recovery. Very much like the EU, we understand that no matter what we do, we are only that drop in the bucket, and we need to do a lot more with the rest of our neighborhood. So that's where Singapore is coming from. We've had some discussion earlier by Sandeep and Melissa also about climate finance objectives. So these are pledged already and now waiting to be fulfilled. Unfortunately, what has been pledged before, it sort of looks a little bit inadequate now, given the severity of events that we're seeing. So moving on, what are ASEAN countries' objectives and concerns? Some of the new issues include, planning for their long-term strategies for decarbonization. We have so far Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia making these announcements. Some of these announcements come with a long-term low-emission development strategy paper, such as Singapore and Indonesia. But for Malaysia, we haven't seen any yet. Okay, carbon pricing. You've heard a lot from Melissa about Article 6. And actually, there are several building blocks towards participating in a voluntary carbon market. And one of those building blocks is, actually putting in place using carbon pricing instruments in your country. And that some of these plans have been announced by Vietnam, for instance, Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And it actually does look like Vietnam might be the very first country to use a carbon pricing instrument. Okay, other objectives and concerns, they want to see a mobilization of that US 100 billion pledge committed by developed countries. This is because we need climate finance, knowledge and tech transfer for mitigation and adaptation purposes. And also there are the various issues that Sandeep highlighted in loss and damage, as well as capacity building. There's a lot of capacity building demand amongst the ASEAN member states. The last one is aligning green recovery with stimulus packages together with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 UN SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so there's an growing understanding now that all of these plans and strategies and roadmaps need to somehow align. And last year, the ASEAN Secretariat came up with an ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. A lot of it read like old wine in new skin, but I think it should be a living document, and they should be working to include more initiatives, new initiatives into their framework. There's also a discussion about, understanding how to align your NDCs with stimulus packages. At the current moment, at the working level across governments, there seems to be this silo between people who are working on climate issues and people who are working on fiscal and monetary policies for economic recovery. I think the two need to talk together and be in the same room so that they can together align their objectives. Another development within ASEAN, as you know, at the end of the year, they will be announcing they've done a feasibility study on ASEAN Green Taxonomy. So they'll be announcing some of these key findings and results. And there's this interest, at least from the finance ministries across ASEAN, to try and find a way to guide new investments into the region to be sustainable and green. Okay, my last slide. The ASEAN summits that took place yesterday has concluded, and there are several outcomes for climate change. One of it is, of course, their annual statement. You might roll your eyes and think, okay, these statements are all talk shop. But I think it's quite interesting this year that they have expressed concerns about unabated rise in GHG emissions. They also included concerns about COVID-19. So you see where they are aligning. There's a call for enhancing ambition, enhancing adaptation by implementing nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches towards climate change. I think that's quite a change. There's also a call towards formulating long-term low-emission development strategies and promoting an intergenerational approach towards climate change. Within the statement, you see ASEAN's concerns also have got to do with ocean health and climate change, air pollution, climate change, and human health. So there's now a greater understanding that all these issues are interlinked, and you cannot look at one issue on its own without looking at the other. There was an announcement by the chair to set up an ASEAN Center for Climate Change in Bandar Seri Begawan. ASEAN also released its first ASEAN State of Climate Change report. I think some of you in the audience may have been part of that report. So it's a good first report that sets out the state of play about climate change in the region and the priority of climate actions. And the last one is there is now a renewed sort of attention paid on youths, recognizing that there are youth concerns and that youth actions can also help to play a part in strengthening climate action. So that's all from me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sharon, so much. Thanks so much for your insightful presentation on climate attitudes in Southeast Asian countries and also what it means for Singapore. So we have quite a number of questions in the Q&A box already. But before that, I'll just like to remind everyone that we are going to go ahead until 11:15 a.m. So please stay on while we take your questions. So I think I'll direct the first question to Sharon because there seems to be a number of questions about your research in the chat box. The first one is from Sarah. She says, "Hi Sharon, thanks for your presentation. How did you select your ASEAN interview sample? As not everyone has a general knowledge on climate issues or even about or be aware about the Paris Agreement." Oh, you are muted, Sharon.
Yes, here I go. I'm cognizant of the fact that the survey may not be completely representative of everyone in Southeast Asia. For instance, your farmer groups, your industrialists, and your other groups may not be fully represented. We did try, so what we did was we went through to our own database that have been following our ICIS research outputs. So the affiliations are quite strong in terms of government and academics. But we also got a fair number of media representatives, IOs, as well as CSOs. We tried to also reach out to people who are non-English speaking. So the survey was actually translated into Laos, Vietnamese, and Bahasa Indonesia. And a lot of it actually went viral because people shared the link. So we cannot identify them anyway, and we don't want to for privacy reasons. And that's where the respondent base came from. Yeah. I hope that answered the question. We will try to do better in the next few years.
Thanks, Sharon. So there are a couple of other questions here in the chat box, but I was thinking since we're talking about climate attitudes that is exhibited by the individual, we can also talk about the relevance of COP26 for the average Singaporean. I mean, a lot of times I feel that, this kind of international negotiations may go over people's heads. So what would you say is the importance of such an important climate meeting for an average person? Melissa, maybe you can start with this.
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks to the person who posed this question. Yes, so I've been tracking COP for a number of years, as has Sandeep, and I think COP is really important because what we don't realize is that governments do represent the interests of citizens, right? When they go to these international meetings, and what they tend to do is actually try and protect the interests of your country's people, those who reside in your country. Generally speaking, we think of it as making sure that the economy is sustainable while trying to protect the climate and trying to protect ourselves from some form of extinction, right? So the reality is that everything at COP has to do with an average person, average Singaporean, in our case in Singapore. And even though, as Sharon said, there's an alphabet soup and some things may go over your head, the simple message is that we have to even at an individual level, work towards reducing our consumption, putting pressure on those who are emitting more, and making sure that we all do our part in addressing climate change. So it is really important. You don't need to think too much about the politics of the COP unless you're there to lobby and you're there to make things happen and make change. But actually, everyone has a part to play, even if you don't go to the COPs.
So I just wanted to follow up on that about what do you think individuals can do? I know in the climate discourse, there's a lot of to and fro about the role of individual action in solving a systemic problem like climate change. But what are your thoughts, panelists? Maybe Sandeep, you can chime in over here.
Oh, sure. Thank you for that. I think this is very relevant question. And I would say first and foremost, you need to really understand in terms of what's your footprint. You can really calculate in terms of what your individual footprint is and how can you really reduce your individual footprint. And the individual footprint depends upon what in terms of your consumption, not only and also your lifestyle. When you talk about the consumption, not only consumption from the material that you use, but also consumption from the things that you eat and where these things coming from. And whenever I give talk, I just give an example. For example, if you go to NTUC Fair Price, you can see an apple that comes from the USA or the same apple that comes from the China or even from Malaysia. So you can make a judgment call in terms of getting an apple from an NTUC Fair Price, which apple that you take. Will you take the high carbon footprint that has been emitted while importing those apples from the USA or those apples imported from China? So there are some simple things that you can really do. And also for any kind of travel that you make, try to make those travel as sustainable as it can. Definitely we cannot be a completely net zero, but definitely completely zero, but we can try to offset some of the carbon, I will say, footprint. Just to give example, as a WWF, as a global organization, we always offset our international travel flight of every individual that takes or they are going in the official trip. So we offset that in the end. So that is basically we are trying what we preach for. So we are adopting those methodology what we preach. So we offset our, let's say, all those carbon, let's say, carbon footprint that is emitted by each and individual staff when they make the official travel. And in our European country, they try as much as to take a local transportation like train and others for visiting one country to another. For example, so many of our European colleagues, they are traveling to Glasgow via train. It's feasible over there because it also depends upon the local context. But in some offices in WWF, we have a cap in the carbon, I would say, in the carbon quota. So we try to reduce the carbon quota of individual offices on an annual basis, so that you can do in your own individual level as well. So these are some of the things that you can really do as an individual, because whether we like it or not, climate change is like a slow poison. You will be hit by the climate impact. It's only a matter of time. So you need to really address and also make sure that some of the key stakeholders that you engage is also really taking the climate issue much more seriously. It's coming much more seriously compared to when I started working on climate change almost 1.5 decades ago, but still it's not there. Like what Melissa present and what we have seen, I think it was day before yesterday when the synthesis report of the NDC came in, we are still heading towards 2.7 degree plus wall. So, and we really need to go down and well below 1.5, and it is the matter of survival for many countries and many vulnerable people all around the world. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. I think things like diet and all, and our choice of transport, and things that should not be underestimated in the grand scheme of things, because it definitely sends a signal to political leaders. So now that we're talking about individual action, there is also a question about what corporates can do. So maybe I'll pose this to Melissa. Someone's asking, are there any plans or strategies for the government to help SMEs or the society transition into a low carbon economy? And I'm posing this to you because I know you're pretty plugged in with what's going on with the Singapore Green Plan and all that. So maybe you can try to tackle this.
Thanks, Audrey. Yes, I do understand that there are some plans to help SMEs. I believe there were a number of announcements over the last couple of years. There is some sort of package to help SMEs. I think yesterday at the Global Compact Network Singapore, there was also an announcement of a new low carbon SG initiative, which will help to train companies in Singapore to be able to disclose and to measure their emissions. And you can't reduce what you can't measure, right? So I think a lot of the large companies in Singapore, the fact that they are large emitters also means that they are tax liable. They pay the carbon tax, or they have to report under the Energy Conservation Act. But I think this person who asked the question is absolutely right. If we want to help move the needle, we have to get small, medium-sized enterprises involved in the fight against climate change, and because they have the potential to grow, and they also, sort of their products and services also contribute towards overall emissions. So it's really important that they start to track and measure. And there are grants out there. All you need to do, I think, is go to the EDB website or MSE websites to try and find like the information about which grants are applicable to your business.
Thanks, Mel. So now that we have kind of covered our bases with an overview, I thought maybe we could tackle some questions about the key issues that will be raised at COP. And of course, as many of you pointed out during your presentations, Article 6, or voluntary carbon market non-market approaches, carbon pricing is going to be a key issue that's been raised. And for those tuning in not from Singapore, Singapore has recently announced ambitions to open a carbon credit trading facility right here. So we would like to hear from the panelists about how do you think this voluntary carbon market in Singapore will be impacted by the discussions on Article 6 at COP26? What if the no consensus is reached? Maybe Sandeep, you can chime in here, because I think one of the mechanisms of Article 6 is that funds collected will be channeled to the Adaptation Fund, which is really crucial for Southeast Asia. So what are your thoughts on these questions?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that's really interesting, and we can really see a big, I would say, buzz on the carbon trading in terms of Singapore trying to be a carbon service hub. That's really great. But if you ask me in terms of volunteering carbon market, no, we really don't need any particular decision on that, because it's already moving and running on. But so Article 6 doesn't really let's say determine in terms of voluntary carbon market, because the Article 6 really determined with the compliance market. So I think there's a difference that we really need to do it. So the compliance market, if you want to I would say, and the compliance market with the scale of the finance in the compliance market may grow in a later stage compared to the voluntary market. But the voluntary market, the niche may be really small, because voluntary market has some kind of limitation compared to the compliance market, because we really don't know whether the carbon trading that has been done to the voluntary market can be part of the NDC, let's say, target. So that's also yet to be defined. So, but the Article 6 is really key, not only from the carbon financing point of view, but also equally from a generating funding for the adaptation fund, because what we civil society we are really lobbying for is as for the review of the adaptation fund that was part of the Kyoto Protocol, we are trying to put levy on the CDM credit, at least in the range from 2 to 5% of every transaction that has been done that goes for the adaptation. But the bigger issue to stabilize the global temperature to 1.5 degree temperature scenario, we really need to understand the value of each carbon credit and also the money that we put for the carbon credit, because for the carbon credit, the pricing is key, and there are many researches that has been done that per ton of carbon needs to be $100 to make it much more viable, and that is really climate friendly. Otherwise, there are many loopholes that may be a little bit jeopardized, or that many loopholes that can come in if you really not been able to price carbon rightfully. So that's really key. But the Article 6 decision, if we get a good decision in Article 6, that will definitely help a lot in terms of boosting the carbon market globally within the compliance market. And that could be part of the country's individual NDC commitment. But for the voluntary carbon market, I think it's already there, and because it's already going. And there are many, I would say, not only country, but many, I would say, the financial sectors, a big conglomerate who are really talking about the net zero target. And I assume for those net zero target, they are really trying to use the carbon market as one of the key way to reach the net zero. But we also need to be very much careful in terms of this won't be a brainwashing, and there needs to be a true carbon reduction so that we can really reach 1.5 degree temperature target as we had listed in the Paris Agreement. So let me stop there with over there.
I thought I might jump in,
yes,
Audrey.
go ahead,
So you wrote this piece in the Straits Times. I've now posted it in the chat box for everyone to take a look. And I believe even if Article 6 is agreed and there's a global carbon market that's been established for some time in the future when it is up and running, I think it would certainly be beneficial to Singapore, because we are putting in place measures to develop ourselves as a carbon services hub. Right, and what that means is that Singapore will then be able to harness some of and benefit from some of the transactions that are made, hopefully on our own CIX or air carbon, those exchanges and marketplaces. But also we will be in a position to ensure that some of the methodologies that we understand them, and that we can ensure environmental integrity of the credits. So basically to say that when we account, we want to make sure that a ton is a ton, and then we're not just trading hot air, basically. Yeah. So I think Singapore stands to benefit a lot from the outcomes, but certainly we don't take for granted that it will, one thing we do say at the COP is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So while we are hopeful, we also have to be very cautious. The talks can break down at any point in time, even if one country decides not to agree, right, at the very last minute. So I think we are really hoping that Minister Grace Fu and her Norwegian counterpart will be able to steer the parties politically in terms of like trying to understand all of the issues that they're concerned about, their positions, and try and come to some landing zone even before week 2. So that's usually week 2 of the COP is usually when the political trading or issues are really laid out. But I think what the UK COP presidency has done is they've started the process a lot earlier. So the ministers have been meeting as early, I think, as start of this year, and there was a big July ministerial. And I think because of COVID and we've not been able to meet in person, the Italians also hosted a number of meetings in person to try and get ministers a bit more familiar with each other, build trust and rapport, and all of that is really important in order to get to a good outcome without cutting corners, as Sharon mentioned. Thanks.
I wanted to come to Sharon on this. I mean, now we've heard from Melissa and Sandeep about the Singapore angle to this, but in your slides you did mention about what ASEAN is looking at for Article 6. So maybe you can chime in from a bit of a regional perspective here.
So I think the voluntary carbon markets has been growing globally, and also within the ASEAN countries NDCs, there's indication some countries want to use some form of a carbon trading mechanism to meet their mitigation targets. So we have our Climate Impact X that's been set up. Malaysia also has plans to set up a voluntary carbon market. And you saw from Melissa's slides that there are several ASEAN countries that have been participating in pilots. I think that's all a very good sign because it means that we are building our knowledge base. And eventually, when you want to have, for instance, if Article 6 falls through, you may want to think about having a regional carbon trading mechanism, which will be very helpful for this region because we are both a sink. I mean, there are many countries in this region that are carbon sinks. Laos, for instance, is about nearly 50% of their land areas covered by forests. And we need to give these countries an incentive, right, to do more, in terms of preserving their land, their forests, and not cutting them down for economic purposes. So I think a regional trading mechanism may be something that ASEAN might want to think about. I don't know the level of negotiations or the talks within ASEAN, but it's something that, if you think about it academically, it's quite doable. And with China opening up their market as well, I think it was 2 months ago that they launched the market. I think there's enough within the Asia Pacific region to go around and to set up their own mechanism. The question, of course, is always, how do you harmonize? How do you make sure everyone's talking about the same things? How are we making sure that we're not trading hot air credits like what Melissa says and not greenwashing? I think the devil is really in the details. It may be easier to say talk to 24 countries in Asia Pacific than compared to 160 over countries, in the UN. And over time, just talking about in the very long-term future, right? Region to region trading may become a possibility. If you grow enough an ASEAN market, you can trade with the EU and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Sharon. That's really interesting. I mean, the talk about the regional carbon markets reminds me of that regional power grid that Singapore wants to establish with our neighbors. Okay, but it's already 11:13, but I just have 2 more questions. Since we're talking about carbon credits and all that, it would be remiss if we did not talk about carbon credits from nature-based solutions. There is a question in the chat box about what is the difference between nature-based and ecosystem-based approaches. Maybe Sandeep, you can take this one.
Sure. Well, I would say, when we talk about the ecosystem-based adaptation approach, basically is the use of ecosystem to build climate resilience. But when we talk about the nature-based solution, it's more about not only from the climate, but also talks about the other, I would say, other different components as well. So in nutshell, if you ask me, the ecosystem-based adaptation approach, I would say almost 100% of the ecosystem-based adaptation approach is equivalent to nature-based solution, but all nature-based solution could not be an ecosystem-based adaptation approach. So there are slightly differences. So like Sharon mentioned, is a old bottle in new wine. It's an old wine in a new bottle. So for me, the EBA is now using as a NBS. But when we talk about the EBA basically focus only for the adaptation component part, not much really talk within the mitigation space, but the NBS, the nature-based solution right now is much more talking in the mitigation aspect and very little in the adaptation space. So there are some differences on that particular component. And the EBA, which is already agreed in the CBD and the UNFCCC process, it has defined, I would say, component and everything, but the NBS, which is really coming forward, it is not really there in the level of the EBA at the international process, in the UN process, I would say. Is much more getting like outside the UN process, but not in the UN process. So that's a key, I would say, a very slightly difference is, for me, if you ask me from an adaptation point of view, it's the same. But if you look from a mitigation point of view, that is slightly different, because most of the NBS now, they are really thinking from a mitigation point of view and a little bit less from the adaptation point of view. But it do has a dual benefit. So that's my take.
Thank you, Sandeep. And I'm just going to conclude this panel discussion with one last question from Mel. There are many other great questions here, but I think you can just email the speakers separately. So the last question is, what does a successful COP look like for Singapore? So this is the most upvoted question, and I think that it would be good to end off on this note so that people can look forward to the discussions kicking off this Sunday. Mel, over to you.
Thanks, Audrey, and of course, Tirun, for that question. So one thing I would like to highlight is that COP26 is not the end. There's a bit of a arrival fallacy, right, with regard to COP26. It's almost as if it's going to solve all of our problems. In fact, it really isn't. It's a means to an end. COP26, what success would look like, I believe, or at least my observation would be that if we can conclude the outstanding Paris Agreement work program issues and ensure that there's a complete Paris rulebook or Katowice climate package plus Glasgow elements, I believe that would be success for everyone, because then we can move on and get to work and implement the Paris Agreement in full. I think that we should be very proud that Singapore has been called upon to help facilitate high-level negotiations. That's really important. Of course, we stand on the shoulder of giants. There are others who have done past work and a lot of great work before, at least also at the working level, all the way up to the ministerial level. And all this work is culminating in COP26. That is important. But beyond this, we must make efforts to fulfill the Paris Agreement, enhance our efforts, enhance ambition in NDCs. The next window is 2025, but before that, we know there's a global stocktake in 2023. So we must not miss this small window of opportunity to close the emissions gap and make sure that we address climate change urgently. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for answering the questions and all of you for your really excellent questions. Today's discussion has been very enjoyable and we have actually exceeded our time. So I apologize that we are not able to take all of them. You may wish to reach out directly to the speakers if you have any burning questions. So thank you all once again for joining us wherever you are in the world and for actively listening and participating. We would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. On your screen, you'll see a QR code and the link to it will be in the chat box. Please access it and give us your feedback on how we can improve. Now it just leaves me to thank the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions and the Energy Studies Institute for organizing this timely webinar on COP26. Thank you all to our speakers, Melissa, Sandeep, and Sharon for sharing your expert knowledge with us. Stay safe and have a great week. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All the best for COP.